Okay, welcome everyone. We are so fortunate today to have two presenters sharing their brilliance and experiences with us. Um, but before I introduce them, I'd just like to remind those who are joining us today that the end of the presentation, there'll be an interactive opportunity to ask some questions. And so it might be helpful for us and the presenters, if as the questions come to you while you're listening to the presentation, you pop them in the chat so everyone can see them, and that also inspires other people to ask questions. So if the questions come to me during the presentation, pop them in the chat. Otherwise, at the end, we will create an opportunity to raise your hand, as Megan has already mentioned. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our two speakers, starting with Dianne Oickle, who is a registered dietitian who's been working in the public health field for 23 years, with 16 years of frontline practice. Her passion for meaningful engagement of people with lived expertise of inequities to inform public health priorities drives her motivation for her work. As a white settler cisgendered woman, her work at the National Collaborating Center for Determinants of Health focuses on community engagement, mental health promotion, intersectoral practice, movement building, and digital equity. Dianne earned a BSc at St. FX University in Nova Scotia and a Master of Science at the University of Saskatchewan, and has been with the National Collaborating Center since 2014. And she's currently based out of Antigonish, Nova Scotia, which is also where she is. And the second speaker, Dr. Lori Wozney, is a colleague and a friend of mine, but she's also the scientific lead in mental health and addictions at IWK Health and co-lead on multiple national and international digital health research initiatives. As an embedded multidisciplinary scientist within the health system, she aims to rethink legacy approaches to health system planning, putting the focus back on patient-important outcomes, solving practical problems of service delivery, generating new evidence through co-designed research, and leveraging digital innovation equitably. She's based out of Halifax, Nova Scotia. So without further ado, over to you.
Great, thanks, Janet. And thanks so much to the KT Canada team. I really appreciate these kinds of opportunities to just share and connect and learn together about the work that we do and have time to reflect on it. So it's been really great for Dianne and I both, and we're really excited to have a chance to kind of walk you through a bit of the unpredictable adventures we've been on over the last couple of years together. And we both are in Nova Scotia. We've actually never met in person. Our entire partnership as in this KT adventure has actually been in the virtual world. So it's good to see you again, Dianne. I'll hand it over to Dianne. We really wanted to ground our presentation and our talk this today, really with our land acknowledgement. So I'll pass it over to you, Dianne.
Thanks. And before we do the land acknowledgement, I want to pick up on what you just said about, creating the space to share this journey. And Rachel commented in the box that she loves the presentation title. And it's true. We could not have predicted from the beginning the story that we're about to tell you. And really that's what we're sharing today is our KT journey with the recent work. Not necessarily the topic. And we love questions, we love comments, and we also love challenges. So if there's things about this that maybe you don't agree with, or pieces that you have suggestions for, that's what KT really is all about. So don't hold back. This is a conversation. So we love that. And I will now, with gratitude and humility, I want to acknowledge that both Lori and I live and work in Mi'kmaq, which is the ancestral unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. I always think really carefully when I do a land acknowledgement, and I'll let you read the rest of it. I attended a presentation last year by a young Indigenous activist in Manitoba, Michael Redhead Champagne. And Michael said, whenever you do a land acknowledgement, don't just do it and check it off the list and move on. You need to do it with some sort of statement of intent, or what it means to you, or what action you plan to take. And so when I do land acknowledgements, and when I give thanks, as it says, to Indigenous communities, we are a national organization. I extend this to Inuit, Métis, and First Nations communities across the country. My heart is especially with the First Nations community in Saskatchewan in light of events this week. And so, my commitment is to reach out to Indigenous partners, friends that I know and have, check in on their wellness. And also the work that we've been doing is really on looking at how colonization intersects with public health practice. Every process that we do, including many of our typical KT things. And so that is also my commitment, is to figure out how that intersects and how that can affect my work going forward. So Laurie, if you can click to go to learning objectives. We have developed 3 learning objectives to frame the discussion today. And really, I'm sharing them here. We're sharing them here to encourage you to think about these as we go through. And then when you do the evaluation at the end, please, please, please refer back to these and tell us whether we met them or not, what we could do differently to meet them better the next time. And as you can see from the objectives, it's really about talking about this KT process and journey that we went through, and how do we take it from just typical KT to mobilization, and what are some of the some of the things that we found helpful in that way. So Laurie, if you can go to the next one, and I'm actually going to hand it back to you.
Great. Dianne and I are going to kind of do a little bit of a dynamic back and forth today to we really try to draw on each other's, perspectives, and not everything that I think happened as we went along this journey is the same as Dianne. So there'll be lots of back and forth, but we thought the best place to sort of situate this whole, journey around KT products and how we mobilize them and the work that we did was really trying to set the stage for how this partnership even came about, and the way that it really even generated to begin with, because that really was such a big part of how we went about the work together. And so within my role at Nova Scotia Health, I was kind of an embedded researcher working on the provincial implementation of digital mental health services, predated COVID, but obviously super accelerated as the health system really transitioned to virtual care. And so within that context, our team really realized that we didn't really have a lot of knowledge and understanding about where issues of equity and digital equity in particular were kind of bumping up against this transition to digital services and virtual care. And so internally as a team, we identified it. I do a lot of research in the area of digital mental health, and the issue of equity is brought up a lot. We have some incredible researchers in Canada that work in that area. And so we really had an awareness as a team that we didn't really know enough about this to really inform the policies that we were creating, the standards we were developing, and some of our internal processes. So at the same time that we had that a recognition of that lack of kind of capacity and knowledge, all the stuff that we've all been experiencing collectively over the last couple of years was happening. So the restrictions related to the pandemic, we had a health system that was going through a lot of change. In Nova Scotia, we were going through a political environment where our government was changing, and so expectations and accountabilities were shifting. We had a really strong emphasis organizationally on, really putting meaningful effort and strategies around digital, around diversity, equity, inclusion, and how we could live into that as teams. And our team was kind of pulled in a whole bunch of different directions. And so we didn't have a whole lot of space to take on a whole new sort of digital equity project on our own, and really needed to have a partner. So a lot of complexity that we were trying to kind of deal with, and that really kind of shaped the partnership and the way that we went about working together for the first time. So, every KT partnership, I think, has an interesting story about how it originated. For Dianne and I, it actually was the digital equivalent of a cold call. I don't know if you call them cold emails now or whatever, but I actually just reached out to the center director, Claire, and said, Claire, we don't know what we're doing. We're hoping that you know more about what's going on than we do. Is there an opportunity here for us to partner together? Is this something that you can help us navigate and figure our way around? Does your team even have capacity to help us work on this? And really was just a very open-ended conversation. And thank goodness Claire is somebody who is very open to sort of having those conversations. And really was just that cold call was really the beginning of all that Dianne and I have kind of done since that time. So kind of exciting to think that one phone call can be so revolutionary in some respects. But Dianne and I are really always interested in learning about how other people would go about these kinds of things. And I've only given you a little snippet of what the context was that started our partnership, but we're kind of curious to know what people on the call thought. What, from your perspective, knowing a little bit about what we did, what do you think the primary planned KT product was that we kind of focused our energies on initially? And I think Megan's going to put up the poll there for us, and we'll give it a couple of minutes. So I'm seeing some different options here. Someone collected the infographic, really interesting, the practice brief, the workshop webinar, the environmental scan. Really interesting. So just pause for one more minute in case there's anybody else that wants to jump on there.
That's so interesting.
Yes, and that, yeah.
Yeah, and actually, I'm a little bit surprised, I have to say.
That's great. And so I think, in a minute, we'll kind of dig into what we actually did do. But I think what's really interesting is that when we first sort of started this, and now looking back, how many of these actually sort of showed up in some of the more opportunistic KT, but really weren't the thing that we had originally planned. But it's working in healthcare organizations, there tends to be sort of these traditional ways that we kind of go about the work. But what's fascinating is actually nobody really picked the one that was the one that we actually started with. So you must be a group of really creative, out of the box thinkers. So I'll pass it over to Dianne to kind of walk us through the next stage of our partnership, which is really actually developing those initial KT products. Thanks, Megan.
This is, it is so interesting, Lori, because nobody picked. But there's a learning in that, right? There's a definite learning in that. And I think what I'm really reflecting on is that, so just so folks know, report. Our go-to KT product at the very beginning of this project was the report. And that was sort of predetermined, honestly. It was predetermined before we got started on the work. And there's a learning in that too, because I think sometimes, when we're doing a project and we predetermine, okay, it's going to look like this, it's fine, but there's limits to that. And it's not necessarily the most effective from a mobilization perspective. So, here's a little bit on the process that we followed for our what I'll call KT project. So NC, considering what everything Lori's told you, NCCDH's role was really as a contractor to Nova Scotia Health. We were tasked with doing a situational assessment on digital equity in Nova Scotia related to mental health and addictions. We had a 10-week period of time to do this situational assessment. And it was, there was some early negotiations, I think, on different components, but really the specifics came in as we sort of dove in, and once the contract got put in place. The project was guided by an advisory group who would also be users of the final product. And so that's some way that we had the professional expertise brought in. We engaged a contractor who then also became a partner and who also is a user of that as well. It was a contractor in PEI, but who had the facilitation skills. So once we all got all that in, our initial discussions were really about a broad strokes approach, as we've been calling it. We took those big contextual ideas that Lori had mentioned around COVID, health systems, political environments, organizational environments. And then, there's that interest in equity and mental health and addictions, and that all of that together is like a big pot of soup. And that's what we use to frame the focus of the project. And there were really, kind of four main stages to that. There was this rapid scan, not a formal rapid review, but really we were calling a rapid scan of literature that was academic in nature, but also gray literature and any projects that we could find. And it was time limited. So it's not pretending to be complete. It is not perfect. There's many things we missed. We just needed a snapshot of what was enough to help sort of form the next steps. And then there was a key informant component. There were focus groups with community organization representatives, but then also health professional organizations and health providers. Within that, there were some individuals who had the lived expertise of mental health and addictions and inequities, but they were, as they were involved and as they represented through the organizations. And then taking what we heard from the scan and the focus groups, that is what we used to build the situational assessment report. So the whole process really was starting broad, like an inverted pyramid, and going down. And then the report itself was its own inverted pyramid, where we kind of presented everything broadly. And, the ideas and the what we heard from focus groups narrowed down to what the implications were for practice and the actions. And then there was the sharing discussion period, as there typically is. The situational assessment report that we had already predetermined was an internal Nova Scotia Health document. And it was not meant for public facing, but we also decided to do an internal facing informational webinar just as a distribution or dissemination. So there was a whole lot. And if you go to the next slide, there was a whole lot that went into one internal product. But what was interesting is, as we were going through these, sort of predetermined and pretty logistical steps, we just started to feel like, okay, there's something else happening here. And there's no other way to describe it really than it was just kind of this feeling. There was something building. And, this shows there were 5 main dimensions of digital equity that we determined at the beginning that would kind of guide how we grouped findings. And this was based in literature and some practice expertise. But what was interesting is that as we dove into these dimensions, and as we overlap the dimensions onto what we saw in all those sources, we started to see some equity themes. And this is really, this is where we kind of went, oh my gosh, there was direct overlap of the themes that arose in each one of these dimensions with core equity issues that, an NCCGH, National Collaborating Center, was managing and what was within our core mandate. And this was where we kind of went, okay, this isn't just an extra project. There are elements that are in our core mandate. And there were elements that Lori and her team were seeing among the communities and the organizations they were working with for mental health and addiction. So, if you look at access, for example, there, we're more than just, who has access to high-speed Wi-Fi and not. It's, those social determinants around rural geography and, age-related disparities and inequities that exist. We looked at affordability. It wasn't just cost of internet. It's and the affordability, this is really important to remember. The affordability piece of digital equity isn't just the cost of the internet. We hear lots of governments making internet cheaper, which is great, but there is still an astronomical cost of living. There's still an astronomical cost of housing, inequitable income. So the affordability piece is couched within these other inequity contributors, really. Safety is really more than just privacy issues around data. It's really about racism, stigma, discrimination. How do those big structural determinants overlap with the digital space? Those are equity components, so more than privacy. So even when you've got privacy in place, there's still an equity piece that needs to be attended to. And so this is sort of represents the big aha moments for us, and where we saw that there was more. There was also these other things happening in the world. COVID-19 was happening, which really revealed inequities in a way that we have just never seen before. COVID also was pushing the whole system very rapidly to rely on digital channels to provide services, whether it's public health, primary care, mental health and addictions. Everything was going online, and some people were rolling right along with that, and some people were getting totally left behind. There were political situations or circumstances, galvanizing moments in terms of racism in Canada and the US. There were elections, I was going to say political races. There were elections, municipal, federal, provincial, happening all over the place. And there was a whole health system that was being affected. So, Lori, did you want to add anything here?
No, I think it's really, for me, like what this kind of showed to us was that, your KT product or the thing that you think you're kind of focusing on as a team and your partnership, like, often has these like tendrils or tentacles that kind of reach into other areas, and where, somebody might not have necessarily had digital equity as their kind of prime directive or prime, it really still touched on things that were relevant happening within the community. And created a lot of opportunity for us to kind of connect and link up some of the work that we were doing with things. And we'll talk a little later about what some of those are, but just the idea that I think sometimes we're kind of narrow in thinking about who our KT products really apply to. And there could be value in thinking about where it might connect with like broader strokes of what's happening in your community.
Yeah, totally agree. And if we go to the next slide, this will explain. So we'll pause here for a second, Lori. So this, we still had this report we had to deliver. So here was our big KT product that we had predetermined and we were going to deliver it. That's great. But because we had also had this realization, we said, you know what? This is more. And so it evolved really. And what it evolved to is, first we thought, let's take the findings of the situational assessment, which solely belongs to Nova Scotia Health, because we did it for them and that is their property, but let's together work with that and develop a practice brief. And this is where mobilization started to take hold. What results, what findings, results, what information from that report could really help inform public health practice in providing digital services with an equitable lens. So we developed this great practice brief that you can contact us if you've got any questions. And this is a co-branded document. So this is public facing. So this was like, okay, it's beyond Nova Scotia. And then someone on Lori's team who's, exponentially creative said, I can do an infographic. I'm going to do an infographic to go along with this practice brief, which made it again condensed, available in a different format in different ways, and yet another tool. So we did not plan for these two things at the beginning. They're also fully available in French, which really then appeals to some of our Francophone audiences that exist nationally. So even before that initial, and it's good to see here, before that initial product was finished, we were already looking for other opportunities. And, we all experienced transformations. We all experienced these moments where we thought, this is bigger. So, I know personally, it wasn't as clear to me in the beginning what the connection to, equity and social determinants was. And now I'm fully, going through that process and being part of that project, I fully appreciate the overlap and the intersection of equity. There was also lots of buzz. We started here at the same time in other public health areas, I guess, and among other colleagues, this buzz around digital equity. So it evolves from the work into those broader areas. I'm going to pass it back to Lori, but Lori, if you want to add anything, I'm happy to hear that.
No, I think it's great. I'm always just sort of amazed at how something that was not our core mandate for either of our organizations or our teams became and you'll see sort of where we're going with it, but just the momentum and the personal values that really drove the work, I think are really important. And I just wanted to pause for a second in case I can see that there were some folks who had comments in the chat and I didn't know if I needed to go back or if those were just from earlier.
I see someone said they love opportunistic KT. And I think just remember that as we keep going that, other than that planned initial report, pretty much everything from this point on has been opportunistic.
And a really big part of that, and I think folks on the call, whether you're working in research or within the health system, I think you can probably resonate, but sometimes things kind of take on a life of their own. And I worked on a lot of different projects regionally and nationally and internationally with all kinds of different teams. And I feel like almost all of them the ones that were really successful have all had this really incredible environment of like building the networks between people, not just for the main thing that you're working on, but just creating all these little offshoots of network and connection. And so for this project, what was really exciting is after we developed those products, we went through this like really accelerated, intense kind of period of unintentional, completely kind of blew up network building and this opportunity to kind of create a lot of shared value and connections with people that we had never worked with before and who worked in different sectors than we did. And what was kind of fascinating about this was that some of this was happening together with each of us, or we were both on the calls or both kind of working, but some of it was also happening on our own. And I think important that there was that trust there for us to be able to kind of work at things and have those conversations and bring people in when we needed to. But what was fascinating was we ended up sort of seeing this, like these broad reach-ins from asking for a message brief for government, for our government office, community orgs who were facing similar issues and just were wondering about how to talk about it or how to educate some of their own staff, and we had research and innovation who were moving really quickly into virtual care and wanting to understand like, where could this bump up against research? We had industry partners who were working on broadband and were just interested in what we had found and heard in the different communities. And so we sort of had this really rapid period of time, which wasn't really organized and wasn't really planned, where we were setting up meetings and having phone calls and creating little, one pagers and like these little kind of offshoot KT products that weren't really the main thing, but really were part of this bridge building and this retranslating of what we had found for different audiences in really simplistic, user-friendly terms, and who those users are were really different. So it was just a really exciting time. And I think sometimes, we work on projects where the KT products have a very narrow reach, but what was exciting about this partnership was it really just exploded. And some of those conversations were really brief. It was a quick call, or it was sending somebody a little document or sending them a link to the report. And others were like these really in-depth conversations about how we could partner together and how we could work. And I always love, like, retrospectively, everything fits so nice into tables, right? Like you can organize everything so beautifully into rows and columns. But at the time, this was kind of a hot mess for Dianne and I, because it was a lot of like, hey, Dianne, there's a conference coming up. Should we put in an abstract? Hey, I heard about whatever. Do you want to jump on the call? Do you have time? There was a lot of messiness, and we're reflecting on it now going, oh, well, this happened at local, regional, national. But at the time, it was really kind of all flowing together and quite dynamic, and sometimes it was like, hey, that's not going to work. Why don't you take that call? There were, opportunities for us to sort of do a lot of, I would call, like, education, or kind of acting more as somebody who's kind of like sharing and helping to update people's awareness and understanding. But there was also lots of times where we got pulled into these opportunities to kind of mobilize what we had done, where we were asked to bring the report to an executive table where they could actually, approve and make decisions on recommendations, or committees that were meeting within government or in other areas at municipal levels, where they were just wondering about how we had gone about what we had done, and could we share, the questions, could we share the report, which was part of why we decided to do that co-branded KT, because people were really asking to have access to something that had really initially been designed for more of an internal document. So lots of really exciting things that at the time didn't really organize and structure themselves in this way. But I just wanted to kind of flag for folks who are getting into this world and thinking about how exciting it is for all these things, that really underpinning all of that were commitment from our leaders on both of our organizations to do this kind of opportunistic, on the fly, in the moment work. There wasn't a lot of budget, but there was a little bit of budget. Conferences, registration fees, people have to travel, people have to create things. We were able to be pretty resourceful across our team and look and say, who's better at doing graphic design, who's better at creating social media campaigns, who has that expertise that we don't have, to bring the work forward. And really that time within our calendar to actually just have what I call kind of off task, or just like interesting conversations where we could just explore things together and weren't kind of always under pressure. And that environment is a lot of privilege that we have within the organizations that we work. And not every organization has that. But I think really importantly, as much as it's opportunistic and it feels like it's just sort of happening and living and fluid, at the same time, there were a lot of kind of core things that helped that be realized. And so we're not going to go through we've just been like all over the country with things, but just to kind of, we don't want to walk you through all of it, but just to kind of highlight some of the bumps in that road too. And not everything goes perfectly well, and not everything turns out the way that you think. From that platform of those kind of two kind of core KT products, public facing products, we were asked to sit on a panel for the Atlantic Summer Institute on healthy and safe communities, and kind of be engaged in a regional conversation across the Atlantic provinces around the work. And then we actually went ahead and submitted an abstract to the Canadian Public Health Association conference, which was not accepted. And Dianne and I like to talk a lot about how, like, sometimes you haven't really formulated the things that you're doing together in a way that other people really understand. And so sometimes those opportunistic KT things don't really go in the direction that you think they're going to go, but that's okay too. And then Dianne, maybe you can talk a little bit about some of the other conferences that we attended.
Yeah, and so, we started, of course, in 2021. You're looking ahead to the next year. So we submitted and got accepted to present. We submitted it as an oral, and they accepted it as a poster to the IUHPE, which is International Union for Health Promotion Education. And this is an international conference that happens every 3 years. So we thought, okay, let's come up with another product, and the team, Lori's creative team and a little bit on our end worked together and developed a poster. And so that poster went to the conference, but that is now also another KT product that we can use in other forums that we, again, just didn't plan on in the very beginning. We got accepted to present at the Alliance for Healthier Communities. And what happened here, it was very interesting. We submitted something on digital equity, and then the Guelph Community Health Center submitted something in digital equity. So the conference came back and said, hey, can you guys just do it together as part of the same session? So we said, sure. So all of a sudden we had a new partner, we had new collaborators, and we did the session together. And it wasn't me that went. Lori didn't go, but one of my colleagues that lives closer went. So we're representative of the organization. So then, in each of our organizations, we were building capacity on the topic as well. And then CPHA said, sure, we'll take it this year. So it went there in 2022, even though they said no in 21. And so we kind of, went with that. And then what was really fascinating was in the midst of all this, we found out about a PhD student at UBC working with the BC Center for Disease Control, doing a scoping review of literature on digital equity in public health. And we just kind of went, what? Like, this can't be. And so we connected with him. He presented also at CPHA. They aligned our two sessions, one after the other. We went to each other's. He helped facilitate discussion at our, and now a relationship has been formed with that team, and we're helping KT their work. Lori's going to probably advise that project going forward in some way. So it has developed into new KT, new opportunities. So if we can go to the next slide, I just showed here, where our connections are. They started with this really cool group in Nova Scotia. In the midst of all that, we also, I didn't mention, we got contacted by 2 researchers in Quebec who were working on COVID and digital channels. So we made some connections there and shared some resources. The piece in Guelph, it was a new partnership that has morphed into other connections in Ontario around this topic. We were also connected with 2 folks in Calgary, at the city of Calgary, not in public health, not in health at all, not even in equity, but who are setting up digital platforms for the city of Calgary and wanted to consider equity. So an audience we never even thought of that we've now connected with and seen the application. And of course, there's some folks in BC, and it's getting a little bit bigger there. So what started in one province has morphed into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 provinces. And, it could expand, it could expand beyond that. And so I think that's what the cool part was about this network building in the national piece. So if we go to the next slide, really what we're talking about here is partnerships. And again, Lori, we also now want to hear a little bit from you again about partnerships and considering things that we've described here, partnerships in KT, partnerships in developing KT and in the mobilization process. In your opinion, what is the most essential component in successful partnership for KT? So we've got a poll here, but if something doesn't appear in the poll that you'd like to add in the chat box, that would also be great. There we go, there's the poll. So what do you think? We're going to tell you what worked for us, but I want to hear from you. What do you think is the most essential component? Maybe it's a stumper. I'm not seeing any responses. Are you seeing any? Oh, there we go.
Come here now. Yeah.
Okay. Contact. Yeah. Credibility. Yeah. Creativity and openness. Yeah. We had all of those things. And the personal credibility is, and keep voting, I'm just going to comment a bit, is not just individuals, but also organization level. Someone's it's hard to pick one. Trust, for sure. Space for conversation, and so not physical space, but space in your work plan, in your work load. It's creating opportunity and prioritizing that, building trust and being transparent, being open and listening. Yeah, all of those things. That's really excellent. Regular contact between key partners. Yeah, so ongoing communications. I think we can go ahead and close that. And the listening piece, right? that was a good point that was put up there by Heather and Rachel, you're reinforcing that yeah, it's listening. I always say to students, there's a difference between telling information and teaching information. And, you know, the teaching part comes from listening and what they, you know, what is understandable on the other end. Laura, did you want to add any comment before I go to, you know, some of the challenges and things that worked for us?
No, I thought the listening was a really good one, because I think, you know, I'm not an expert in KT, and like, I feel like I've learned so much from Dianne, just like, this is the space that she works in. And I think sometimes, you know, when you get into these partnerships, it's really exciting and you feel like you have an expertise in something and a knowledge in something, but often a lot of what's really great is actually just listening to the expertise and the experience of the people that are in the partnership. And I just thought that was a really good one to add, because I do think that was really key.
Yeah, and we can go to the next slide. You know, I had someone say to me sometime last year, you know, listening is the most important job I do. And so that kind of sticks with me. So, you know, we had a lot, before I sort of tell you what our perspectives were on the most important factors for us. We did have challenges, you know, like any project, we had challenges. You know, Laura already mentioned we had never met. We still haven't met. We're having lunch together next week in Halifax for the first time met a year and a half later. So now this is going to be great, but you know, it just speaks to the potential of these digital channels. But you know, it was also interesting because we also had our own digital realities. You know, the pandemic was happening. I live in the country. Rural internet is sketchy at best, even when you live in a rural area that's well serviced. You know, we sometimes had digital glitches. We sometimes had challenges connecting with other partners digitally that we needed to. Nobody was seeing each other. So there was all of that. You know, we were living some of the realities of the digital challenges. You know, in the case of NCCDH, the project started out as complementary work, not our core mandate of what we're funded by the Federal Public Health Agency to do. Of course, it morphed into that, and that's, you know, became a little easier. One of the challenges with the large diffuse policy networks is that, you know, it makes KT more difficult because there's a larger number of people. They have competing interests. Some of those interests are not public health related. Some of them are not health related. Some of them are not mental health and addictions related. Some of them are not equity related. So, you know, you're in this policy, when you take it from, you know, the table of folks that buy in automatically out to the policy world, there's a whole lot of noise that it's mixed in with. We had competing priorities on each end, you know, broadly in terms of time and priority, but we were also at year end. It was happening between January and March 31st, which is fiscal year end for us and for a lot of organizations. And, you know, it all had to be done in that time. We also had some different understandings at the beginning of what the core concepts were, even of equity, even of, you know, mental health promotion versus treatment, of social determinants. So we just, not conflicting, just slightly different. So we needed to sort of, you know, align that a little bit to help direct the project. And the complexity was my other analogy. I love analogies. It's like a perpetual motion machine. There are all these pieces happening, and they all have their own little life and life cycle, but then of course they all affected the momentum of these other pieces. And that was true in the initial stages, but even as the work went along, and even as we got these opportunistic opportunities, I guess, it still was, things were depending on each other. If we go to the next slide, you know, this is what really we can say for us were the essential factors. So trust, probably hands down. I was joking at one point that, you know, trust, flexibility, creativity. Did I mention trust? Oh yeah. And did I mention trust? And did I mention trust? Because, you know, we just, our organizations trusted each other based on reputation and previous work. And even though Lori and I didn't know each other directly, because our organizations trusted each other, we also then trusted each other. And I think it's a really an asset-based approach to go into something and automatically trust your colleagues rather than automatically doubt. That's a deficit-based approach. So we approach the whole thing from a place of asset. Flexibility is the other piece. You've heard, you know, as we develop these products that we wouldn't have guessed could have happened, we just had to be ready to respond. And we didn't do everything that we could have done. So, you know, there is an element of realistic goals and, you know, was realistically achievable, but also being flexible. Maybe you go away from your initial idea and come back, and being able to do that together, you know, through the listening and the regular communication and being open, that all, everything you guys have offered, it all feeds into that. the creativity, you know, I'm a bit artsy, Lori's a bit artsy, there's artsy people on that team, we're creative, we're big picture thinkers. And so, you know, we were not just task oriented. It wasn't just about getting a product done. It was about, you know, what are the possibilities? What else could this look like? And the collective capacity is an important piece to remember here, is that, you know, it's not so much how creative is Dianne versus Lori, it's collectively with all of the partners in and all of the people and staff in each organization, what's the collective capacity of the collaboration to help lift up this work? And then the transferability of trust, but also skills, and then the organizational level relationships. And I think, you know, one of the most important things to remember here is that none of this would have been possible if it was just NCCDH or if it was just Nova Scotia Health. Even, you know, for sure, not if it was just Dianne or just Lori, but even if it was just we're an organization, it would not have evolved in the way it evolved. And there's no magic formula. It was organic, but there's possibility in that. So Lori, I'm going to pass it back to you, but if you want to add anything here that I've missed, that would be great.
Yeah, I think those are so true. And again, like I don't think these are necessarily like rocket science, like findings or factors that we kind of distilled from the process, but just kind of goes back to that, some of those intangibles, not intangibles, but you know what I mean? Like the things that just sort of make teams work that we don't always sort of like highlight or understand necessarily how they developed. But I think that trust was really there from the beginning, and something we just continue to kind of mature. And I see that as like part of what we're going to talk about next is like, where do we go from here? How do we keep the momentum? And I think that's part of, you know, that trusting relationship is what actually, like, you can make a lot of products, you can do a lot of stuff, but it's that, you know, one, and willingness to work together and trusting that you kind of have the grounded values that are driving the work that are similar, that kind of moves you forward. So I think everybody on the call, and I don't see all your faces right now with my screen, but I assume that folks are a mix of people working in research and healthcare and decision making. But I think we all probably have a shared desire to kind of move away from like the flash in the pan and KT. That's we create a thing and it's a bit of a buzz and we kind of share it and it's on social media and we all kind of talk about it, and but then it doesn't actually really develop into anything that really sustains a change within the healthcare system, or that actually, you know, realizes the changes of the recommendations. And so part of, you know, our reflection on today and kind of sharing with you was really about putting some focus to thinking about the sustainability of the work. Opportunistic is amazing. I'm a curious person. Dianne's a curious person. We could spend we could all just like switch our careers and spend all of our time on digital equity now if we really wanted to. But how do we actually sustain this work in a way that's, you know, that the right people are working on it, that we're not just kind of letting it die on the vine? And we just kind of had we only have a few minutes left, really. Just wanted to kind of touch really quickly across a couple of things to kind of take away. So one for us is really the need to be really intentional, but at the same time informal, if that makes sense, around how we build connections with people. Like going out for a coffee. It's so great to be able to like see Dianne next week or have a coffee with a team member, you know, make a phone call, make a cold call, make a cold email, you know, do those reach outs and do a lot of, what I love where we're at now in our partnership is Dianne and I do a lot of this, just like, hey, there's a conference coming up. Hey, it might not even be related to what we're doing. Hey, here's a trainee that I'm working with. I want to connect with you so you can have a conversation. There's just a lot of this trying to expand our network and making time to actually be intentional about helping, you know, trainees and new folks that are new to this network and new to this partnership, you know, get built in and baked into the process. So I don't know, Dianne, if you have anything to comment on that one, or if you want me to move on to the
you know, the only thing I would add is just that, you know, this work gets done through relationships. It doesn't get done through a report. It doesn't get done through a webinar. It gets done through relationships, and that's sort of the piece that we've carried through. So, yeah. You're welcome, Lori.
Another big thing for us is really like trying to keep the focus away from just like the buzzy products, and really like, how does this kind of get embedded into operational procedures and policies and the pieces that actually drive the day-to-day work within healthcare. And so, you know, it's great that we created all of this work and the work that we do together. But I think what we both feel is really exciting is that this work has actually now been picked up into some of those more institutionalization of the KT stuff. So, you know, we have onboarding standards that now have baked in, you know, diversity, equity, inclusion, and cultural relevance and safety and those kind of things into our decision making about mental health services that we're going to onboard. We have a comms plan for the year, and part of what we've now decided to do is highlight digital literacy opportunities within the community as part of kind of our ongoing comms plan. So a lot of the work is now kind of moving from the KT products and the work that Dianne and I did to being really embedded, almost, kind of the new normal and just part of the way that we're going to evolve as an organization. And I think sometimes, KT can kind of get refocused on the product and not on the end thing, which is really having that work really embedded over time. And I know, Dianne, for you, some of that work kind of relates to where you're going as an organization as well, if you want to comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly the work that we do as a KT organization. We're a knowledge mobilization organization. This is our work with this now. I mean, we of course apply those same principles to our digital work, but we don't work as much with the public. We work very little with the public. We're working with providers. So our work now is helping public health, in our case, organizations, providers, service providers, embed this equitable approach to digital services within their work. So it's less about, okay, we'll send them all the report, but how do we help them take that equity lens to anything that they're doing digitally?
Yeah. And that's a really good tie-in with the evaluating progress thing, because I think both Dianne and I really have reflected on, we want to evaluate the products, right? You want to look at, did they reach people? Are they using them? Are the reports being mobilized? But also the relational pieces. So what new relationships came out of this? What new networks and new partnerships? And trying to be careful not to just kind of get stuck on the number of reshares or posts or downloads or whatever, but also the relational capital that's kind of built in the process and evaluating that as part of the work that we do. And just we want to make sure we leave some time for questions. But the last thing we want to say is I think Dianne and I both really reflect on all this wild ride over the last couple of years as thinking about part of maintaining momentum is going to be us continuing to go back to try new things and do weird stuff together and take risks and just kind of be uncomfortable in some of the things. Hey, I've never done this before. Do you want to try to do that together? And I think there's a lot of value in teams, stretching themselves a little bit to try things that might not have been the way they normally do things or the way that they had planned things. And I think a lot about the grant writing that we do and how we do such detailed planning on our KT processes. But, how do we leave room for some of this really fluid, just in the moment, on the fly, that's really exciting and creative? Because I think there's a lot of momentum that gets generated when teams have that kind of flexibility. And I'll leave Dianne, I'll give you the last word and then we'll open it up for questions.
You're so good, Lori. The last word belongs with both of us. I agree with everything you've said around the, taking risks and trying new approaches. I think we're just really thankful for the relationship we've developed too. And, I'm really thankful for the foresight that Lori had to know that this topic would be of interest, because I wouldn't have, and CCDH probably wouldn't have thought to address this. So even the impetus for something like this comes collectively. So yeah, and I just really appreciate everyone that has stuck around for this conversation and that attended today, and really love to hear your thoughts and questions on this. And remember, KT is fun. We had fun, and we had fun even putting this presentation together, and even doing what we've done, here. I said to Lori the other day, we're KTing KT. And this piece is also, this presentation itself is KT about a KT process. And I think we have to remember the value of that is that, this work doesn't just lead into, KTing the product, but what do we learn about processes that are innovative or a little bit different? So yeah, we're appreciating this opportunity for our own learning.
Thanks, Lori, and thanks, Dianne. So we'll get started with throwing the floor open to questions from the participants. Clapping hands.
Thanks, Rachel. That was nice. Thank you, Sue.
And I have a question that can start us off, perhaps. And so this idea of partnership and building partnerships, and you've talked a lot about that and a lot about some of the challenges that go along with creating partnerships. I think that's in the KT world. Many of us rely on our partnerships and our networks to help evolve and grow our work. So I guess my question to you, Lori, you talked about the cold call that was the starting point for this, and some folks can feel a little anxious about making these cold calls. I wonder if you could tell me what were some of the bumps to getting this started. How long it took for you to build this partnership once you made the cold call. And I'd also like to know how many cold calls you've made that have not resulted in something that was fruitful. Because I think we need to learn that not every cold call is going to result in something phenomenal as you have in front of you. So just that whole idea of risk taking, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. I've definitely had, like, as a researcher, I've had lots of times when I've reached out to folks thinking, oh, this is so great, we totally perfectly align. And that, you know, for lots of different reasons, they didn't want to bite, you know what I mean? Like, there just wasn't capacity, it wasn't totally aligned, it felt like it was going to be extra work for them. So like, there's always lots of reasons. So definitely have had lots of times when I thought in my mind I was going to have a great partnership, it just didn't work. I think for me, like, part of the reach out to Claire was kind of like, one was an urgency. So like, I think, you know, I kind of felt like I really needed to find somebody, and I looked locally. I think there's a lot of value in like looking, what are my assets locally that are already kind of working in my space. We share some common things. I didn't like reach out to anybody like in Saskatchewan or something right away to try to, you know, build a new relationship. There was something common there. So I think that local asset mapping kind of thing in my head was probably part of what made the cold calling a little less stressful. But I also think it was like, in my mind, I kind of thought, if it isn't NCCDH, they might know where I should go next. They might be at least the connector to get me closer. And I think that's another kind of way I might say I would strategize around that reach out and that taking a risk is, even if they aren't the right person, they might know the right person or be able to connect. And they're more informed than I am. So I think that was really a big part of it. So yeah, I would say those are kind of some of those pieces, but definitely like, it's made me revisit the hesitation I have sometimes of reaching out to people thinking, oh, they're too fancy, they're way better researchers than I am, or oh wow, they wouldn't have time for this. Because I think there are opportunities and they come along as you go. And it did take a long time to get us rolling. But as you can see, like, we're not stopping. So yeah. I see a hand there.
Heather.
Yeah, hello. Really enjoyed that. I thought that was really, really interesting. And I liked how you kept coming back to your KT tools or your KT products and stuff, and sort of being really thoughtful about that. And you're clearly sort of on to something like the growth. And I should say, I'm actually in Guelph. I live in Guelph. So it's always nice to have a Guelph shout out when you're at a presentation. But I was going to ask, you know, I really appreciated sort of the comments about the hot mess and the, you know, being in this place where, you know, you're really trying to engage and listen to everybody. And I'm kind of involved in a project right now too, where sometimes it seems a bit like this is a project being co-led by a patient partner. It's actually her project and I'm the researcher helping her with it. And so I love this open-mindedness and hot mess, but then, and I'm a researcher. So at a certain point, I sort of think, okay, enough of the hot mess. We just have to do something. The work has to get done. So maybe just talk a little bit about if you, presumably you had that tension and how you managed it.
Did you want to start, Dianne?
Yeah, I just, I'm giggling because, you know, it's hot mess is such a good way to describe it. And when Lori said that, I was like, that's totally it. And I think, you know, so I'm a qualitative research background, right? And so the way I handle a hot mess or a pot of soup is, you know, you just keep adding to it until you start to see themes, right? And when you start to see themes, you go, okay, that's the direction. And I think, and you know, Lori, you can clarify if I got it wrong. That was a little bit of what happened with us is as things went along, we're like, oh, let's try this. And that's the hot mess space. You can't do everything. And you can't do everything that's going to make every single person happy. And that was also obvious to us in the very beginning. One of the things that really helped us was having really clear objectives and a goal for the project, even when back in the initial situational assessment piece, because as we got asked or, you know, ideas about, well, what about this? What about this? It doesn't fit with the goals of the project right now. So it kept it realistic in scope, and we were really careful about scope creep, that it could get bigger and bigger and bigger and not meet the original goal. So that really helped us. I think, you know, as we were hearing all these suggestions, as we started to see, okay, you know, there's 2 or 3 different sectors or different partners that have mentioned this, and this is kind of a theme around, you know, application to seniors, for example, or application to mental health and addictions. Like you kind of look for those things that thread through. And I think for us, you know, we also have to be sort of prepared to say no sometimes, that it's not us. You know, in the case of the city of Calgary, for example, we sent them the information and they received it, and that's great. municipal digital platforms are not in in our core mandate. They're not in Lori's core mandate. And sometimes it's okay if you just share the information. It's okay if you say, no, we can do this, but we can't do this. So I don't know if that helps at all. It's sort of keeping it scope. But Lori, can you answer that any better than I just did?
I could totally relate to that feeling, and like I work with lots of students too, and it's like things just they start to just like blow up, and there's so many opportunities. But I love the idea of you can say no, and I think we need to empower ourselves as researchers and people to say, like, I just can't add one more thing, because if I do, it's the quality of what I'm going to be able to give you is a lot less. And I think we need to acknowledge that and just be more honest with each other in our partnerships about what we can do. And I think that's important. But I would also say, like, now that I'm kind of reflecting on in the middle of the hot mess, I think there were still some project management-y type things, even though that's like a weird thing to say, but it was opportunistic. But it's not like we didn't have an agenda for our meetings, or we didn't have a dry run of something, or a practice thing, or something to kind of guide the what's the somebody would send out after the meeting, you're going to do this, I'm going to do this. Like, there was still some of that project management and task and kind of accountability. And I know we didn't really talk about that because neither of us are sort of heavy-handed accountability people, but there still was kind of I'm going to do this, you're going to do that, and an expectation that we would, kind of manage that and get tasks done. So I do think there's some strength in us all learning a little bit more about project management and like how to kind of manage these kind of KT things, and how much effort actually goes into creating a poster for a conference, and all of those kind of things. So that would my only add would be that there was some project management-y type stuff that happened.
Does that help, Heather? Did that answer what? Okay.
Oh yeah, for sure. No, really helpful.
And I think sometimes, when we have to say no to things, or if there's things people want us to do that we can't do, or, when there's a lot of parties involved, there's a lot of, potential, you have a parking lot and you put things there. And if you can't do it, do we connect them to others who can? Do we bring in other people? That's where the flexibility piece, as Lori was talking, I'm like, yeah. And we only were able to do some of those things because we were flexible and we were willing to let, have it go further. We also had a leader, like in the case of when Lori first approached NCCDH, she approached our director, scientific director, Claire Becker. Well, Claire is the type of leader who'll go, yeah, I'll consider everything. I'll consider everything, whether it's in our mandate or not. And I'll figure out where's the intersection. And if it doesn't fall, I'll point in the right direction. So it's a bit of an approach to things too. I mean, she's really wonderful at finding opportunities that I would never see because I'm a little funneled sometimes. So it's collective, I guess.
So I want to thank you for the honesty in speaking about, you talked about opportunistic KT and the number of lines in the water that you had and what you threw out there, some of which was successful and some of which wasn't successful. So I appreciate and value the fact that you would share those experiences as well with our group, particularly the trainees in the audience who are listening to you. But I realize we only have 1 minute left, but you described what has come from your partnership. Have you thought or reflected at all what would have happened had you not, and would you have still, followed this line of research or this line of inquiry?
I think I would have understood it cognitively. I would have read articles and have a knowledge piece, but I love that it's made me an advocate. And I love that working with Dianne has made this way more prominent in all of my other work. It's just kind of brought a lot of other research that I'm doing. So I think I would have had a knowledge base, but I don't think the activism and the baking it into the system and really working to get it integrated would have been there. And for sure it was the sum of the parts kind of situation. It was certainly a synergy that wouldn't have realized any of really what we did if we had to try to do it on our own.
Yeah, I totally agree. And, I think truthfully, I don't know if I would have completely seen the application of it to public health and to health equity. I could have read and I probably could have appreciated it conceptually, but I don't know that I would have really taken it seriously. I would have been skeptical unless it was brought to us. And unless, we had an organization that was willing to do something on contract outside of our mandate that sometimes brings it in. So it's my learning, my own personal learning is that, some of the stuff that I think lives outside in that hot mess area really actually is the core of what we do. And so, that was a big learning for me, for sure.
Wonderful, wonderful, thanks. So.
But yeah, I would do it again in a heartbeat. So to answer the other part of the question, absolutely.
Okay, so that brings to conclusion our presentation. Thank you so much. And Megan has put in the Dropbox the link to the evaluation. Those are really important for KT Canada